Is it viable to have a visual effects company that solely works in the film industry? The answer to that would be absolutely no. And I recognize that back when I was at ILM, looking at other revenue streams that were outside of the film industry. The real question, which is something I don't know if you really want to get into, which is it viable to have a visual effects company? And my answer to that is no. Because the business model, the way it stands today, which is a fixed contract to do something that's never been done before, and gives the visual effects facility all of the responsibility, but none of the authority, that's just a model of madness. One can't survive not making money. One can't survive not having cash flow. You need to be a profitable business. If not, it's not a business.
You are listening to the 21 Artist Show, a podcast that inspires creatives to make meaningful content to pursue their passions. I'm talking with creators, artists, and engineers about their careers, lessons they have learned, and how to make an impact. I'm your host, Alexander Richter. I'm a technical director and coach in visual effects, animation, and games. For more content, go to 21artistshow.com. Enjoy the show. Scott Ross is an important part of the visual effects history. He was a manager at ILM, senior VP at Lucasfilm, chairman and CEO of Digital Domain, and one of the founding members of the Visual Effects Society. He summarized his experience and part of the visual effects history in his book, Upstart. It's great to have him on the show to talk about what the visual effects was when he started, what it is today, and what it will become in the future. Thank you for joining us, Scott.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Really nice to have you. And I also had the opportunity to meet you at the FMX and also saw your speech at the FMX and also read your book, which I really enjoyed. And I think it's an interesting read also in terms of the history of visual effects, your personal history, but also how the visual effects is like developed over the last 30 years, 40 years.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to do, is I was hoping to meld sort of my personal story, hopefully to keep it interesting, and hopefully people found that interesting, with, you know, the history of modern day visual effects technology and some war stories as well.
Was film on visual effects something you wanted to go into, or was it that you fall into it?
I went to university back in the early 70s, and at that time, you might recall, well, you probably wouldn't because you weren't born, there was this war raging in Southeast Asia, a Vietnam War, and I was doing everything I could not to be drafted. And so as a result, I went to school, and when I got to school, I thought I would be a music major at university. Unfortunately, I had no traditional academic training about music, and so all these little kids that were around me were quite skilled in 17th century counterpoint harmony, and I knew the Rolling Stones. So I needed to find a major that I could continue to have my student classification so I wouldn't get drafted. And so the only thing that seemed somewhat interesting to me was to be a film major. My interests were, I loved film. I was always technically adept, but ultimately, really, my interest was always music, and I sort of fell into that industry sort of by happenstance.
How did you end up being a manager at ILM and then later VP at Lucasfilm? How did that kind of transition happen after your study?
So when I got out of university, I decided that I would focus, now the Vietnam War was over, and so I could now focus on what I really wanted to do, which was to be a musician. So I started playing in bands and taking lessons and really schooling myself in the model of understanding jazz, which is a rather complex musical form. And I needed a job, and I was walking around and I ran into an old classmate, and I told him that I used to be a sound engineer, which I was, and I worked for people like the Allman Brothers Band and the Miles Davis Group. And so this person said, hey, there's an opportunity here for you to come and be a sound man on sports live television. And as a result, living in the Bay Area, I wound up being introduced to a company called OnePass. And OnePass was the preeminent production and post-production company in the Bay Area. And I got there as a sound person and then wound up moving up the ranks, ultimately, becoming its president. And I had made a name for myself. I was also the president of the trade association in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Film Council. And I guess I was recognized by Lucasfilm in the mid-1980s as being somebody that might come on board and help out at Industrial Light and Magic. And so they recruited me. And after 70 some odd interviews at ILM, I was finally offered the job. Got there and, again, moved up the ranks to become ILM's general manager, and then ultimately to become a senior vice president overseeing multiple divisions, including EditDroid and SoundDroid and Skywalker Sound and Lucasfilm commercials and attractions, etc. And then ultimately, I wound up having a problem, and as I always have with authority, and the president of the company was a bean counter. And the bean counter basically was a brake pedal. And everything he did was to try to slow things down. They weren't investing in technology. And I realized that technology was the lifeblood of a company like Industrial Light and Magic and Skywalker Sound. And so I went for it. And ultimately, the president of the company was keeping me away from George Lucas. And I never really was able to put a relationship together with him. And interestingly enough, while I was managing almost all of the major divisions within Lucasfilm, I never really got to meet George, never had any time to spend with him, ultimately had a real issue with the president of the company, who was my boss, and eventually wound up leaving and then forming Digital Domain with James Cameron and Stan Winston.
I was wondering, when I was reading it in the book, and you mentioned a situation where you actually meet George Lucas, I think later in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Independent of that, and that was more or less your first encounter with your actual boss in a way. I was wondering, when I was reading that, was it because of the system of the hierarchy that George Lucas was so isolated, or was it his like style of maybe he was like backing off of a lot of these elements? Why did it happen that for example you never actually interacted with George Lucas?
So it's conjecture on my part, because as I said, I only met him twice. But my take is now in retrospect was that George wound up sort of pulling himself out of any day-to-day or even any oversight of all of Lucasfilm, in part because of the terrible experience he had with Howard the Duck. So the concept that George had was he was going to build this movie studio in Marin County away from the craziness of Hollywood, and then give his friends and other creative people an opportunity to make films, again, far from the maddening crowd. And so his two friends, Gloria and Willard, had pitched him on a movie called Howard the Duck, and George exec produced it. And, having George sort of won the World Cup every year, which was, Star Wars and, all of Indiana Jones, I think he thought that he couldn't fail. And that ultimately when Howard the Duck came out, I think the front page of the Daily Variety was Howard's Gooses Cooked. And it was a terrible flop. In retrospect, it's funny, but at the time, I think it really hit him hard, having been a superstar, for all of these, last 4 or 5 years, and now to have such an obvious flop that the industry sort of took him down a few pegs. Then additionally, George is, I think, again, a fairly introspective, quiet person that doesn't like being around a lot of people and doesn't like, he's the antithesis of James Cameron in a lot of ways. Then you add to the mix this fellow, Doug Norby, who is the president, who reported to George, and then all of the divisions and the ones that I oversaw reported to Doug Norby. And Doug was a bean counter. He was a finance guy. And so he was doing everything he could to make sure that the communication line between any of his subordinates, including myself, directly to George couldn't happen. Now, I don't know if it was George who said to Norby, whatever you do, I don't want to speak to any of these people, it's now yours, or if it was Norby's Machiavellian sensibility of, I'm not going to let anybody have a relationship with George. And in fact, the situation for me was, because I had been so successful in turning Industrial Light and Magic around, I think Norby was threatened that I would have a position by speaking to George, and that George and I might have a Vulcan mind meld, and eventually that Norby would be pushed out of the way. So it was a complex situation. And again, this is all conjecture on my part, because, as I said, I only met the man twice.
What would you have done differently in this particular situation?
I tried, but every time I would try, and a roadblock would come in my way. So the only two avenues to George was either Doug Norby, who was doing everything he could to make sure that I couldn't talk to George, and Jane Bay, who was George's personal administrative assistant. And she, I think, was given directions to keep everybody pardon the pun, at bay, and not allow people to have direct interaction with George. What I would have done differently was I responded to the hierarchy, and I accepted the way it was, in a way, which was, my boss who set my salary and gave me my reviews. I didn't really want to piss him off. But what I should have done was pissed him off. I pissed him off later. But when I realized that the guy was just useless as, I won't even say it. Ultimately, had I done it again, I would have literally knocked on George's door, because my sense is that I had a lot to say. Things were changing in a big way. I'll give you an example. Here's a perfect example. A lot of people think of George Lucas as this incredibly technical, advanced, sort of techno-dweeb kind of guy. So George decided to reinvigorate his Indiana Jones stuff and did a television show called The Young Indiana Jones. But it was a television show, and it was not film. And so because it was a television show, there were lots of tools available to George in post-production that were not available to him or other filmmakers in the film process because of resolution, etc. So when he was doing Indiana Jones, young Indy, he was doing a bunch of post-production work at a video post-production house in San Francisco. I believe it was called Veritel. And he, of course, is blown away by this new device called a Harry, which was made by Quantel, that you could actually manipulate images in real time, see the result, and then, plug it right into your edit. So he winds up calling Doug Norby, because that's his conduit, and tells Norby that Industrial Light and Magic needs to buy a whole bunch of these Harrys. Now, the problem with the Harry was it only worked at 525 lines of resolution, and here we were working at 1,800 or 2,000 lines of resolution. It was not even a high-def product, so we couldn't use it in film. I tried to have a conversation with George, but I couldn't, to try to say to George, hey, listen, you can't use Harrys in film. And because Doug Norby was not technical, he didn't understand it. So I think it got back to George that Scott Ross, the maverick that he was unwilling to listen to George and buy all of these Harrys, as opposed to understanding that he didn't get that this was in video resolution and it had not yet been delivering capabilities at film resolution.
First thing, I was surprised about this situation, because you think if you work at ILM, especially at that time, if you work at Lucasfilm, that you will be connected to people like George Lucas, but it was kind of surprising. But the other thing that surprised me was that thing that you also mentioned just now, that you helped turn around ILM's financial situation, basically. And it kind of reminds me of what happens in the last few years, with COVID and actor strike and the folding of Technicolor, and the problem of profit margin and sustainability of the industry. So I would like to get a little bit into that part where, can you describe the problem of ILM when you were joining, and what you needed to do to make it basically profitable?
So there were two issues at ILM when I first joined, neither of which I was aware of, right? So even when I was interviewing, I didn't ask the right questions, right? I was so excited about the possibility of working for Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic that I wasn't mature enough or sophisticated enough to ask the other questions, which is, can I see your balance sheet? Can I see your cash flow statement? What's your profit and loss look like? What are the big issues that ILM faces? I didn't do any of that. I was doing everything I could to have them like me and admire me so that I would get hired.
You would think like they are very positive, you know, they are ILM, they are Lucasfilm. You think they're swimming in money a little bit in a way.
There's that old blues song, you know, you can't judge a book by looking at its cover. So, you know, I was swept away by, as you just mentioned, I was swept away by what Lucasfilm was and what ILM was and all of those shiny Oscars on the wall that I just assumed, bad move on my part, that everything was wonderful and I was walking into, you know, just an opportunity that was exciting and perfect, only to find out that not only the financial situation was a mess, which it was, they were losing money, but the morale of Industrial Light and Magic was in the toilet, right? So you would think you would walk in there and all these people would be really turned on as to who they were and what they were doing. But because of their, in some ways, it lines up with George's experience in Howard the Duck, because they were the preeminent visual effects company and were winning all the Academy Awards and everybody thought of them as the player. Because ILM was losing money, George, as well as all of the other divisions, by the way, George was looking for a way to stop the bleeding. And so what he does is he hires a finance dweeb, green eye shade kind of CFO guy. And Norby was exactly the wrong thing that he should have hired. He should have hired somebody that could see the future and build opportunities and build morale within Industrial Light and Magic. So Norby cut off all of the fun that was ILM, which was developing new technologies, starting new avenues of revenue. He was the brake pedal. So when I got there, I was shocked. I was really shocked. That was the issue at ILM. And in a way, you know, ILM was very cloistered, as was Lucasfilm in the Bay Area. There was very little interface between people that worked at Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic and Skywalker with the rest of the film and video community in the San Francisco Bay Area. And because of that, because of being so cloistered and self-protective, most of the people that worked there had worked there for, you know, for 10 years or 8 years, however it was. And they were terribly depressed because with Norby cutting off the opportunity for growth, with Norby not allowing new technologies to come into play, everybody was really upset. And with George not being present. So most of the people that came to work in Industrial Light and Magic, at least in the early years, had direct interface with Lucas. And now you don't have a leader, the genius leader that brought all the people to work there. And now you have a bean counter who's not allowing you to have donuts and coffee and parties and new equipment and new technology and new software and computers. Everybody was super depressed. And so both of those things had to be turned around. The financial situation, obviously a company that doesn't make money is not really a company. And then a company where your workforce is overworked and depressed and sees no future, there's no hope.
I'm also looking a little bit at the current time and seeing similarities, similar problems going on. And so I'm wondering, what was the things that you did there?
First thing that I needed to do was to recognize what the problems were. You know, so I'm walking around with stars in my eyes going, holy crap, I just had a meeting with Steven Spielberg. So I had to put lead weights on my feet and bring me back down to earth to understand, oh my goodness, this is a problem. Then the next thing I had to do, because Industrial Light and Magic was so cloistered, it was like the Hells Angels. And so they were not going to allow me in. I was a new kid. And not only was I a new kid, I was a new kid that didn't really understand, in their mind, what was happening. I was a new kid that came from video, right? We're filmmakers. And I was young. So when I got there, the response was not what I had expected. I expected, like when I was at OnePass, to be embraced and thought of as a leader and taken into consideration and seen as part of the team and maybe even as a way to solve the problems for the people that work there. But when I first got there, and for several months, I was shut out. It was like, you're not part of the Hells Angels, get out of here. So first I had to get the stars out of my eyes, then I had to find out what the issues were, then I needed to be accepted to be able to do the changes that I wanted to do, and ultimately that happened, and it was probably a 6-month process. Then once I was in the position of being the general manager and having the support of the team, now what I did was I decided not to pay any attention to Norby and the powers that be at the ranch, and I just decided to run the company like it was my company. And I realized that I was the gas pedal, Norby was the brake, and that I needed to put my foot to the metal. And to do that, I needed to buy a bunch of equipment, even though I was told I couldn't. I needed to organize the company in a way that was efficient and allowed the real organizational structure and organizational chart to make sense, because it didn't when I got there. And then I had to have absolute transparency to the workforce so they understood what it was that we were all trying to do. And then, I think as a leader, you have to bring hope to the table. You have to bring a vision of where we're going that's exciting and realistic, and you have to perform to it. And you have to surround yourself with people that buy into that vision.
I want to look into the concept that you kind of used there and on digital domain of the three-legged stool.
Aha.
And I think that is an important thing that helps also to understand the stability of how to build a stable environment.
The three-legged stool concept sort of came to me that, if you only have 2 legs of a stool, the stool falls over. It cannot support weight unless there are 3 legs. And so I realized that the 3 legs of the stool were, technology, finance, and creativity. And you needed to have all of those things to have the appropriate culture. I didn't walk in like taking a business course from somebody at Stanford or Harvard and said, this is the way you address it. It came organically over a period of time, recognizing that if you don't have one of those legs, the stool's going to fall over.
What did you focus on basically to create the stability?
I had to be a multiprocessor. I had to focus on all 3 of them at the same time, right? It wasn't like first I get one leg and then the stool keeps tipping over, right? So then I get the other leg. Even if the legs are short, you need to have all 3 legs. So I multiprocessed and focused on all 3. So on the finance side, one of the first things that I did was I pulled our finance department internal to Industrial Light and Magic. We were not going to work actively with the finance group over at Skywalker Ranch. We would have it at Industrial Light and Magic. I would have a CFO at ILM, and we would set our financial priorities, our financial rules and regulations, et cetera, internally that we would focus on. And one of the things was, as I mentioned, was the finance group over at Skywalker Ranch, again, headed ultimately by Norby, was you can't spend any money. And I just said, screw that. I'm going to spend money because that's a critical thing to do here. Another thing is to focus on revenue, right? So if you don't have the revenue and you're just spending, you're going to wind up bankrupt or, in arrears. And so I needed to be able to figure out a way to increase revenue. And the way to do that, I thought, was to take the skill sets and knowledge and capabilities of the existing infrastructure at Industrial Light and Magic and apply them to different revenue sources. So commercials was one, and the margins in commercials were pretty good. Attractions, which was location-based entertainment. So I started to look at how do I increase revenue by utilizing the same infrastructure that we had on our feature film division. And the other thing that it would do, One of the problems we had with features, at least at the time, was that all of the movies that ILM would be working on with, quote, big visual effects, blockbuster popcorn movies were released in the summer. And so the work was cyclical. We would get really, really busy, and then people would be working crazy overtime hours, and then we would deliver our shots sometime in May or early June, and then it would go to the lab and they'd have to make prints, and so you'd get a summer release. And then once we delivered our shots, there was no other work. And so, ILM would lay off, 60% or so of its staff. I had to smooth out that curve of revenue, and I did that by, having new divisions and using the assets of ILM to focus on new revenue streams. That also helped the morale of the company as well, because now people weren't working their butts off all the time and then boom, laid off, and now what are you going to do? And because ILM was the only sort of major player in the Bay Area, it wasn't like you could go to work somewhere else. That was it. So I needed to be able to do that from a financial perspective. From a technology perspective, because I came out of video post-production, and most of the work that I was doing, that my team was doing in our video post-production world, was computer-based. Whether it was random access memory editing, or whether it was Quantel Harries and Paintbox, or whether it was Ranks Intel Telecines. Once I realized what the issue was in terms of sort of technology, and that we needed that there was the possibility of changing the analog photochemical process to a digital process. Of course, there were other people at ILM that were incredibly brilliant and wonderful and smart and whatnot. People like Dennis Murin and Scott Squires and, George Joblove and Doug Kay and John Knoll. And that core team sort of focused on the fact that we were going to change that photochemical process, and we were going to change it to a digital process. And so because we were Industrial Light and Magic and Lucasfilm, we had enough weight in the marketplace to go out to various vendors like Selco and SGI and Kodak and Quantel and say, hey guys, let's all get together, because there's this new thing that's coming, and we should be on the leading spear point of the leading edge of this to create the new pipeline for digital filmmaking. And so I put together a group interestingly enough, we went to London, or Newbury, where Quantel was located, and we brought together all of those companies and sat down and had, like a 2 or 3 day, I don't recall exactly, conversation about where this needed to go. And my hope is that each one of these companies, Quantel having the great graphics user interface, SGI having a great video I/O and digital I/O, and Selco being a film recorder, and I thought that this consortium would come together and we could solve the problem collaboratively. Of course, capitalism being what it is and corporations being the way they are, each one of those companies went away and said, wow, this sounds really cool. We want to own the market. And so each one of these companies decided that they would have a turnkey situation. And of course, that didn't work. And eventually SGI goes out of business, Kodak goes sort of out of business, Selco, I don't even know where they're at, and Quantel, I think they stopped making the devices that they were making, and ultimately a new era of filmmaking was born as a result, and now things started to move into the digital domain, pardon the pun.
This is the transition, I would say. After all the experience at ILM and Lucasfilm, you had some issues with your president and kind of got ousted, if that's the right word that I would use. You went on a moment to find yourself a little bit, and then ended up founding Digital Domain with James Cameron. What was the main factor for you to, instead of like looking for another job, why did you decide to?
First of all, I was ousted because of the threat that I had to Norby. Norby was trying to get rid of me for about a year, but he couldn't, right? Because all of my reviews and everything that I had done was pretty successful, and I had the support of, I had moved from the outside guy, and now I was the leader of the Hells Angels. So it was difficult for Norby to get rid of me, and he tried his best. He wound up giving me other divisions that were losing money in the hopes that I couldn't turn them around. And so eventually he sort of screwed my staff out of a bonus that he actually instituted and prompted. And so I went ahead to my staff and said, okay, boys and girls, we're going to move forward and we're going to kick some butt, and then we're going to make some money, which, by the way, we were terribly underpaid at that time, considering what was happening in Silicon Valley. So I was very concerned about losing my creatives and my leadership and my technical people to what was happening only like 40 miles away in Silicon Valley. And so this bonus plan was very exciting to me. And I thought, now we can retain our employees by paying them on success-based issues. But Norby then sort of pulled a gun out and said, nope, we're not going to pay them, even though the folks that work for me did it, and they were incredibly successful. But Norby said no. And so at that point I thought, okay, F you, Norby, I'm your superstar, I'm going to quit. And so I said, well, if you don't pay my guys and gals the bonuses that they deserve, which we promised that they've worked really hard for, if you don't do that, well, then I'm out of here. And that was exactly what Norby wanted to hear. He literally pulled my resignation letter out of his desk and laid it on me. And so that was the end of my relationship with Lucasfilm. Though I did try to come back because Norby ultimately was fired by George. And I thought, well, now that Norby's gone, and George recognizes, hopefully, that I'm critical and really important to his companies, that he would bring me back and allow me to run the company. But no, I never was able to get to George, and I had to deal with his lawyers, and I was told unequivocally that I quit, and since I quit, I'm history. So now I'm out of a job. I've got a wife that works at the home, but doesn't bring in any revenue. I've got 3 kids. I've got a house and 2 cars, and what the hell am I going to do? So of course, what I start to do is knock on the doors of all of the studios, of which I've had relationships with over the years, in hoping that I would get a job that way. Because, I was not raised or didn't have the makeup of being entrepreneurial. I was always a salaried person. But after knocking on lots of doors and meeting lots of headhunters, I was unhireable. So now what am I going to do?
Unhireable, why? What happened? Like, why you're unhireable? If you work for ILM, Lucasfilm, like, isn't that the status symbol where you just, like, everyone should be like happy to have you?
Yeah, I was unhireable for a couple of reasons. One reason was I could never be hired at another visual effects company because when I was running ILM, I'm a tough competitor. And so I would go in there knuckles to knuckles, head to head, and fight for the work that I wanted to come to ILM, and my opponents were those other visual effects companies. So the other visual effects companies, A, already had somebody that was running the company, and B, they weren't going to hire a person that sort of took them to task over the years. So I didn't have a shot at working in another visual effects company. So I thought, okay, I'll work at a studio. So I went and knocked on studio doors, and I recall Sandy Rabins, who was a senior executive at the Walt Disney Company, said to me, Scott, you'll never fit in a studio. I said, why is that? She said, because I've watched you in your career, and you don't deal well with bullshit. And at the studios, there's a ton of bullshit. And so unless you have the makeup of being able to smile and tell the powers that be, even though that they're wrong, that they're right, because you got to have that politic, which I don't think you have. And since you are the maverick that you are and successful, you really need to start your own company and not work for someone else, at which point I then decided that that's what I had to do.
Do you think there was a little bit of maybe you being too successful, with too aggressive on that part, and that also kind of soured the relationship with a few of these?
No. I think at the other visual effects companies, the last thing they wanted to do is bring somebody in who could run. I wasn't going to come into another visual effects company as a number two. At this point, I was number one. And so if you're going to bring me into a visual effects company, I needed to run the company. And they knew that that's what I needed to do. And they weren't willing to allow that to happen because chances are, whether it was Richard Endland and Boss or John Dykstra at Apogee, or the various people that had left ILM and now had formed their own companies, they were the big kahuna, and they didn't want another kahuna with them, right? And as far as the studios were concerned, I think Sandy Rabins was right, which was, I'm not a politically correct person to understand how to, sort of zen and the art of filmmaking. I'm a WYSIWYG guy. What you see is what you get. And I hope that comes forward in the book. Now, I've learned over time that that's maybe not the way to really succeed, right? That you have to be able to sort of play the game and ultimately get there. And ultimately, my New York street kid maverick style winds up, sort of getting in the way of my relationship with Jim Cameron, which is ultimately, something that I wish I would have done differently, and followed my friend John Landau, who really understood that you sort of got to kiss butt to be able to get your way and ultimately be successful. May he rest in peace. And the other person too that has been very, very successful at that was one of my proteges, which was Jim Morris, who's now the president of Pixar. And Jim was very, very good at the political game. He understood that you don't piss off people at the top, even if they're wrong, especially if they're wrong. That was a lesson that I learned way too late in life.
Yeah, and that's also one of the things that I like, why I do this podcast, because it's always about all these lessons that obviously sometimes we need to do them ourselves, to make the mistake ourselves, to actually learn from it. Sometimes hearing it is not enough. Sometimes if you hear people like you, for example, Scott, telling certain stories and certain resumes, and this is why what I would not do again. I think it's really nice to have this, okay, I heard this story, I see the situation in my own life. Maybe I'm an artist, maybe I'm a general manager, whatever. I recognize certain patterns that I heard in this podcast, for example, and maybe I will take this advice and say, you know what, let me be more strategical, let me be more political. I think that is one of the many things that why I always want to kind of reflect on things like your experience. What I also liked about your book, it was also the personal history. It also showed a lot of the struggles that you had, like in betweens, for example, the roles after ILM, as you mentioned in the book also, where it wasn't that easy. And I think every one of you would probably think the same way, is like, oh, I just worked at ILM, I worked at Lucasfilm. It shouldn't be hard to find a good job for me. If you don't, suddenly you feel like the bottom is falling off, basically, because you don't really know what to do.
I think your point's really good, which is, here's another analogy. I'm sorry about my analogies. We look at musicians, like really, really talented musicians, and you think to yourself, I guess Eric Clapton was just born coming out of the vaginal canal with a guitar in his hand, and he just has got the gift of God, and he is able to play the way he plays. Or John Coltrane, wow, what a talented guy, and he obviously has this incredible gift. But what you don't see is you don't see the hours upon hours and days and months and years of 10 hours a day of playing scales, 10 hours a day of understanding theory. You don't see all of the hard work that went into allowing Coltrane to become Coltrane. And so if you don't understand that there's a really difficult, hard process to get to where you want to go, you just assume, he worked for ILM and now the world opens up and opportunities happen. And no, it's really a lot of hard work. And oftentimes personal sacrifice. And personal sacrifice for me was the relationship that I had with my ex-wife and my kids. And that's a big issue, I think, for most of the people, particularly in the visual effects or animation world, is their dedication to their craft and their dedication to the amount of hours that they need to work pulls them away from the essence of being a human being. So here they are trying to create something that's human-like, that moves people emotionally, but they're removed from their day-to-day human activity of being a dad or a mom. And so that's a difficult sort of balance to have, and one needs to have a plan and understand what's important and what's not important. And I hope that came out in the book as well.
We want to create a certain humanity in our movies and our games, but a lot of the artists and technical people who work on films and games are very nerdy and introverted or extroverted, but in a very small social way. You cannot put them out in the world and they will figure out and we can interact with all of them. It's not the most common thing. It's a very nerdy community creating massive products basically for a lot of people. And one of the reasons is you work 10 hours a day for maybe 6 days a week or 7 days
if you're lucky, 10 hours a day.
Basically, to some degree you disconnect to the real world, and one of the many problems and the changes that we had with the mental health recognition is that burnout is a thing that people were maybe ignoring to some degree much more in the past. And one of them is because you are just kind of in this bubble of production, of impossible deadlines and so on. And I think that is also why I like the title of your book, basically, of the managing the unmanageable, because that is part of the problem that this industry is so difficult to handle, to manage, basically, that the people who are at the bottom, basically the workers, the artists and technicians, that they suffer especially on that level, not only with their health, but also the job security, but also the disconnect to, as you said, family, social life, maybe even hobbies. The question that kind of maybe ties also to the digital domain is like, would you say that visual effects is a good business model in terms of if I opening a visual effects studio with the low margin that they're famous for? Is it survivable to have a pure film visual effects studio, or do you have to do things like, for example, Framestore? They basically do film as a side project and commercials as their main thing. Macrovision or Accenture is doing film and series as a side project, but the main thing is visualization of car and stuff like that. Do you see that visual effects, especially for film, is a valuable business model?
Let me take it back a little bit for a second. So what I realized also, now this is 2013, I realized that one of the issues that I thought our industry had was that the visual effects worker basically sat in a dark room, whether it was in Mumbai, Pune, Los Angeles, the UK, wherever. They sat in a dark room and they were isolated. They were working on their computer. They didn't have very much interaction in a social world, et cetera. And so I wound up helping build an organization called Trojan Horse Was a Unicorn, which was a get-together of digital artists and creators and software people and technical people in Portugal. The concept was to create a tribe. The concept was that the visual effects worker that was working in Pune was very, very similar in many ways to the visual effects worker that was working in the UK or Los Angeles. They lived in different places, but they all sat in dark rooms and they were all isolated and they really didn't have a community. And so one of the things that I realized, having gone to Burning Man, was that community was really critical. Plus, being the age that I was, going back to the late 60s, early 70s, of sort of the anti-war peace hippie movement, that community was really important to who we were and how we valued our values, right? So I thought that putting that together would be an important way to be able to have people come together and realize that you're not alone, that there is a community, that there are people like you, they have the same tastes, the same sensibilities. They might even speak a different language, but they're really speaking the same language, which is technology and creativity. I think that was important. Now, the second part of your question is it viable to have a visual effects company that solely works in the film industry? The answer to that would be absolutely no. And I recognize that back when I was at ILM, looking at other revenue streams that were outside of the film industry. The real question, which is something I don't know if you really want to get into, which is it viable to have a visual effects company? And my answer to that is no, because the business model, the way it stands today, which is a fixed contract to do something that's never been done before, and gives the visual effects facility all of the responsibility, but none of the authority, that's just a model of madness. One can't survive not making money. One can't survive not having cash flow. You need to be a profitable business. If not, it's not a business. So under the current constraints of the current business model, it's a non-starter. You can't survive. And if you do survive, you're surviving by the skin of your teeth. It's a squeaky existence. And that's why we see multiple visual effects facilities over the last 15 years or so go belly up, bankrupt, lose money, close down, lay off people. And you know, a lot of that has to do with the awful business model. Now, the big elephant in the room, which is we're at a flexion point right now. And that flexion point is probably the most critical, exciting, scary, strange, throw as many adjectives in as you can, point in the history of humankind, which is the coming of agentic AI, which will fundamentally change the way everything works in the world. And how does it affect media and entertainment is a really big question. And how does it affect visual effects under the current model and the current business situation is, I'm very, very concerned about it, because the way to be able, as Jim Cameron said, he needs to figure out a way to make those $200 million movies that he makes for 50% of that at $100 million. So besides Jim taking a serious haircut and not being paid exorbitant fees, you know, how many submarines or airplanes or helicopter does one man need? He's looking at the majority of the expenses of the films that he makes and others like him that make are visual effects costs. And so how do you reduce the cost of visual effects using AI? Well, 80% of the cost of visual effects are the personnel that are creating the visual effects. And so you have this visual effects factory loaded with visual effects workers that are working to be able to satisfy the vision of the director. Well, if you want to cut costs and significantly cut costs and do it relatively easily with AI tools that are coming, one gets rid of a bunch of visual effects workers. When I left Industrial Light and Magic to form Digital Domain in the early 90s, I realized that the future of visual effects was digital, and hence the name Digital Domain. And I saw the transition that happened at ILM and was part of that transition, moving away from photochemical analog to this digital brave new world, that when I started my new company, Digital Domain, it was going to be Digital Domain. And now we're at a new flexion point, which is the transition from just a digital workforce, now all over the world. What is the new process? And I think the new process is going to be using AI tools to lower the cost, which means getting rid of a lot of people. And so if I was to form a quote, visual effects company today, I would recognize that those AI tools are going to get rid of most of those folks in India that are doing, you know, RPM stuff. and a lot of folks within my facility that are not secondary or tertiary creative people, and form a smaller company of creative people that have vision and capabilities and skills on a creative level that have the use of AI tools.
Welcome to our short mid-episode coffee break. If you love the content and would like to have a successful career in the film or games industry yourself, check out my website 21artistshow.com. There you can find helpful articles, masterclasses, and coaching opportunities that help dozens of my students to bring their profession to the next level. That's all. Check out 21artistshow.com and share the podcast with cool people you know. Let's continue with the episode. That time when you found the Digital Domain as well with James Cameron, were you aware of these? Because you must be aware from the ILM experience and Lucasfilm experience that it is a very difficult to nonsensical environment. So when you found a Digital Domain, was there something that you said, okay, it doesn't work, so I will make it different and I will bring James Cameron in to do that with him? So what was the step that you wanted to make it different?
So let me put you in the picture. So here I am. I'm living in Marin. I have a wife that doesn't work except in the home. I have 3 children, one of them in private school. I have a house in Lake Tahoe, and I have 2 cars. And I don't have a proverbial pot to piss in. I have no money. I don't come from wealth. My father and mother had no money. I'm sort of a working class guy. And so I'm faced with the problem of I need to figure out a way that I can make a living so I can support my family, right? You know, necessity is the mother of invention. So I needed to figure out something so that I could support my family, put food on the table. And starting Digital Domain, after having knocked on bunches of doors and it not working, was my only alternative. The fact that James Cameron, or as I call him, Jim.
Everyone who's working with James Cameron calls him Jim, so it's always like, someone works with James,
Right.
It's like Jim.
Well, except for his wives, Linda used to call him Jimbo, and I never was comfortable with that, so I just call him Jim. So when I speak of Jim, it's James Cameron. I realized that if I was to start a company and find the financing, finding the financing would be difficult, that at least in the United States, celebrity doesn't speak, it screams. And I needed somebody who could be Queen Elizabeth, who was the person people wanted to work with. From a visual effects point of view, most visual effects workers working with Jim Cameron was tantamount to, I'm getting closer to winning that Oscar. And from an investor point of view, while I had the stats of running a company and running it successfully and having my folks win Academy Awards, boy, when you put Jim Cameron in the mix, now people get really excited.
Which time of James Cameron was that, basically? Was it Abyss time?
Our first experience with Jim would have been The Abyss, right? At ILM. And then Terminator 2, right? So now Cameron he's not the superstar he is today, but he's definitely a major player in Hollywood. And so when Jim and I spoke, he expressed his interest in being my partner. I had trepidation because, I had experiences with directors in the past, and the thought of having a director being my partner, that didn't necessarily sit well with me. But on the other hand, I needed to feed my family. So having Jim being involved as a partner in Digital Domain was definitely an advantage, both from an investment point of view as well as from pulling together a team.
It's kind of interesting that a bunch of visual effects studios are built from directors like, George Lucas, ILM, Peter Jackson's Weta, which I worked for. Funny enough, on James' Avatar 2, that's what I was working as a technical director, was working at Weta from Peter Jackson. And then Digital Domain, part of it was by James Cameron. But in this case, James Cameron seems to be, you mentioned in the book that he had a different mindset of what Digital Domain will be for him than it will be for you. And he seems to have this from your point of view, it seems that he wanted to have a studio like similar to George Lucas ILM, something that supports his vision, where he has a lot of like creative control, basically.
I think Jim, and I think it's played out with the Avatar series as well. I don't know if he's ever said it, but I think Jim's hero was George Lucas. Who he wanted to be like was like being George Lucas. And so I believe while, I had a relationship with Jim while I was at ILM, but I wouldn't say it was a close relationship. In fact, I'm not sure Jim has close relationships. But, he knew who I was, and my pedigree of being the person that ran Industrial Light and Magic and my staff being really supportive of who I was, I think gave Jim the confidence that he would partner with me. In retrospect, I think Jim's interest in having Digital Domain was like George's ownership of Industrial Light and Magic. The difference being is that ILM was wholly owned by George Lucas, and George was the person who was responsible financially for Industrial Light and Magic staying alive, i.e. he would write checks to keep it alive. Jim, on the other hand, didn't have that issue with Digital Domain because it wasn't his money. He put no money in. It was IBM's money at first and then Cox's money secondarily. But Jim didn't have that financial responsibility of Digital Domain that George had with ILM. So I think his end game was that Digital Domain would act in the way that ILM acted for George to him. I, on the other hand, always wanted to be a filmmaker. And so, actually, I always wanted to be John Coltrane. But once I realized that I wasn't going to put in those 12 hours a day playing, diminished scales or whatnot and learning 2-5-1s, what I really wanted to do was be a filmmaker. And so the opportunity to have something like Digital Domain, I thought could catapult the company into being a production company. And the model for that was what, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter did at Pixar, which was they were a visual effects company. Actually, they were part of Industrial Light and Magic and Lucasfilm. And then they leveraged themselves ultimately to become the Pixar that we know and love today. And they do that because, A, that was their vision. That was always Catmull's vision, even when he was at New York Institute of Technology. And they had John Lasseter, who is this incredibly creative, wonderful person who was able to create stuff like Toy Story. And I thought, naively so, that Cameron would be my John Lasseter, I would be Ed Catmull, and Digital Domain would be have a similar model as Pixar had, but not in the animation world, in the live action world. So I thought the animation world was crowded at that point with Pixar and PDI becoming DreamWorks Animation, as well as, Blue Sky and what was happening in Fox. I thought the market for animation was considerably less than the market for big budget visual effects films. And because it was a crowded marketplace, plus I was not really moved by animation in the same way as I was moved by big films, I thought Digital Domain could leverage itself to become the Pixar of live action filmmaking.
Do you think he was the wrong person to found the studio with, or do you think it's just a problem of setup? It was like, how you set up yourself, how you set up him as part of the thing?
Well, we have to get back to, I'm this really scared guy who doesn't have a pot to piss in, and I'm concerned that I'm not going to be able to make my mortgage payments, and I'm concerned that I'm going to have to pull my kids out of school, and that I'm going to have to sell my house, and where the hell am I going to go, and what am I going to do, and how do my skill sets transfer into another business? I'm scared to death at this point. I'm the sole financial supporter of my family. And at this point, my family numbers 5 people, including myself. So I'm just scared to death. And I don't see myself in a position of being able to demand or ask or change the power dynamic that is between Jim Cameron and myself. And so I'm just feeling like I'm lucky that I have Jim Cameron, because if I didn't have Jim Cameron, who would I have? And my runway of my severance from Lucasfilm is running out. So it was more a matter of, let me take what I have right here and hope for the best. In the beginning, I was pretty taken by Jim. A, he's James Cameron, and B, he's allowing, I'm feeling like I'm sitting at the table with a major filmmaker, and we're discussing what the future of visual effects could be. And a lot of the things that he's saying, I'm agreeing with, which is allowing the director to be more involved in the process of visual effects. Yeah, I was excited and scared. And my ability to make changes in the moment and demand things was not even something that I was thinking about. And a great example of that is, then Jim brings Stan Winston into the mix. As far as I could tell, Stan Winston offers nothing. Right? I mean, he's a wonderful guy, and we became friends, and I love him, and he's a great creature creator and whatnot. But what does he really bring to Digital Domain? His name is not going to bring workers, because I already have Jim Cameron. His name is not going to bring an investor, because I already have Jim Cameron. And then what does he really know about visual effects anyway? So why is Stan now an equal member of this team? And I wasn't in a position to turn to Cameron and say, Jim, what are you thinking? Why are you bringing Stan Winston, a lovely guy and incredibly creative, but what value would he have to Digital Domain? I just sort of sat there shocked the day that Cameron brought Stan to Lightstorm and said, oh, by the way, this is our third partner. I just closed my mouth and said nothing, because what do you say to Jim Cameron? No, Jim, you're just wrong. What the hell? What's that all about? And then, suffer the wrath of Jim, who was like, no, he's going to be part of the team, and I want him part of the team. So, that was the hand that was dealt.
I actually have students who come to learn Python courses recently from Digital Domain, and I was like, oh, this is like a nice coincidence with you as well, coming there. What made Digital Domain survive until this day? Because it's not a small feat to survive for that long. What are the things that you feel like you set up and it continues, or maybe even grown, that make it still run successfully until now? Successfully in, maybe in quotes, but in terms of it is still there and it is still big.
I was somewhat, taken by your term Digital Domain being successful. So let's get back to those three legs of the stool, right? Does Digital Domain sit firmly on those three legs of a stool? Well, because they're a public company, we can look under the hood and see exactly how they're doing financially. And they lose so much money every year. I think last year they lost, I want to say $48 million, right? And the year before that, I think they lost more than $48 million. And so every year, basically, since I left the company has lost money. So that leg is not there, unless, of course, there is a fake leg that's placed under that stool. And so the question becomes, what is that fake leg? And, let's put it to you this way. There is a whole lot of Chinese money that needs to be laundered and taken out of China. And Digital Domain is owned by a Chinese company. I don't know where the money is coming from, but it's coming from somewhere, because they still make their payroll, they still pay for their rent, they still hire new people, etc. But they lose gobs and gobs of money every year. The concept of successful has to, in my opinion, and maybe I'm naive, but in my opinion, needs to be also a profitable business, which Digital Domain has not been since 2006 when I sold the company.
What was the guidance that you started basically before you left? That you, first thing, that you kept it away from being, bankruptcy, and second, what was the thing that you wanted it to become in the future to increase the profit, basically? Because I remember one of the things that you started was IP.
Again, my dream always was to be a studio that produced its own intellectual property, and we did the best we could. The problem was, at least in the film industry, that one of our partners, well, actually two of our partners, one of our partners was James Cameron, who owned his own intellectual property company called Lightstorm. And so if his efforts were to keep Digital Domain as his ILM, I don't think he saw Digital Domain becoming a content owner, because he was a content owner. And I'm not sure it was in his interest to have Digital Domain move into that area, because he wanted Digital Domain to stay in the area that it was in. Additionally, one of our partners was Cox, and Cox had worked with a company called Reicher Entertainment. And they too, Reicher Entertainment was in the television business, but that they were a content, IP creator, and Cox made an investment in Reicher, and the Reicher folks didn't make it happen. And so Cox had a bad taste in their mouth from the point of view of being an IP provider, a content provider. And then there was the IBM Corporation, which was our third partner. And the IBM Corporation didn't understand content at all. So that's not the reason that they invested in Digital Domain. So I had all of these forces basically saying, that's not the direction we want the company to go in. It was an impossibility for us to get there. As far as keeping the company from going bankrupt, part of that had to do with when Jim Cameron and Stan decided they were no longer really going to be a part of the company. They'd still own their shares, but that they would not really necessarily work with us. That took a loss opportunity off the table, because most every time we worked with Jim Cameron, we wound up losing money on his projects. So that, in addition with really good senior management at our company, we were actually able to be profitable. There were times we would lose money, but be profitable and build up a treasury of millions and millions of dollars, that when we hit a difficult bump in the road, that we were able to survive. So it was a combination of things that kept Digital Domain, at least Digital Domain 1.0, when I was running the company, vibrant and alive. And then finally, the other thing is, that other part of that stool, which is culture. The culture at Digital Domain was strong. People really got it and understood it. And even to this day, there are men and women that get together that worked at Digital Domain 1.0, or as I like to call it, Digital Domain. They get together and remember the great days that they had there as some of the best days of their career. And if we look at, the leaders in the industry today, the creative and technical leaders in the industry today, a large portion of them got their start at Digital Domain 1.0. I'm very proud of that.
It reminds me a little bit on the story of Carl Rosendale of PDI, where he also described this as before it was bought by DreamWorks, how everyone kind of were excited to work there. And I actually met a few people when I was working at Dwarf Animation Studio from PDI, and they're still 20 years later, they're still hassing about it. It was such a great experience. They're still telling war stories basically 20 years later about their experience at PDI. And I think if you have this kind of environment where people still talk about something they worked on 20 years ago, still to this day, I think something special was happening there.
I always wonder about that, because I'm never quite sure why that is. Because at the time when Digital Domain was being formed and we were all working together, there were a lot of complaints, too many hours, we're working like crazy, we need more, I need an Aeron chair.
In the past, everything is a little bit better.
Yeah, everything looks really nice in the rear view mirror, right? They hold that out as being the golden age of their careers. So, I'm thankful for that.
Maybe because it's less interesting. I think I remember when talking to a lot of people that I recently talked to Kim Davidson, who is the Side Effects CEO and president, and to a few other people, and they all describe how much of a problem-solving environment it was in the past. It was always,
we didn't have this. We need to figure it out. You know, it was literally always this kind of like, we need some water human. I don't know how to do this. Let's figure it out. And it was always this excitement of figuring it out, where nowadays it's more the excitement of finding the right value. Where does the slider has to go so the rendering is finished in 2 hours instead of 4? One of the part is this, you didn't know, there was no clear line of how to do things. There was, to some degree, maybe also more freedom, even for maybe the organization was sometimes more loose. It was still also this kind of like, everyone had to figure it out much more than nowadays, and it was much more exhilarating, exciting kind of. I think that is one part of the difference.
Yeah, I do. I agree with you. I think today it's become more of a manufacturing process. You know, even we talk about pipeline. It's a lot more manufacturing than it is discovery and invention. It also was very, very new. And so because of the newness of it, that was exciting. It's like, it's like a new girlfriend or a new boyfriend. It's like, wow, that's exciting. I got to tell you, after 30 years of marriage, it's not so exciting anymore. You really got to work at making it exciting. But in the early stages, it's absolutely exhilarating. So I think you have a point there.
One of the things that I really like about you as a person and how what you describe in the book is the advocacy for kind of the industry. Like besides, in the book you mentioned a few situations where you tried to bring the visual studios together. One of the things that you also did is being one of the founding members of the Visual Effects Society. So when you started this part as one of the members, like what was the idea behind it, and how do you see it became now the Visual Effects Society?
Early on, and you can read it in the book, I tried to put together a group called the Association of Visual Effects Creators. I thought it was cute because I did take French when I was in high school and junior high school, and the acronym is AVEC, meaning with, right? I thought, God, I'm so smart. But actually it didn't work, and there was no with, because the competition was so fierce that VFX or DreamQuest Images couldn't see ever sitting at the same table with Industrial Light and Magic. The competition was sort of, almost in death throes. They were willing to take each other to the ground, and they didn't trust anybody. If you worked for another visual effects company, you were the enemy. They didn't realize that, in fact, there was strength in numbers and unity, and in fact, the real enemy, if we can call it the enemy, was the business model. It was not our competitor. So that fell apart. It was disheartening, for sure. Then when I got to Digital Domain, all of a sudden there was this new group called the Visual Effects Society. And I saw the industry as being in turmoil, and I saw that the business model was killing off companies, and I still hoped for a trade association. So when I got involved with the Visual Effects Society as one of its founding members, my hope was that what I was trying to do with AVEC could happen with the VES. And I thought maybe this had a shot, because this was not necessarily me or any of the other leaders of the big visual effects companies deciding to form this association. It was somebody on the outside that we really didn't even know, Tom Atkin, who was putting this society together. And my hope was that it would actually have an impact on the way in which the business worked. Turns out that that was not the intention of the Visual Effects Society, and definitely not the courage that the other players that came to the table to form this society. And so once I started to realize that the Visual Effects Society was really about, throwing parties and giving awards and offering some services to visual effects workers, and that it was not going to fix the root problem of what the industry was, I became really disenchanted with the Visual Effects Society. And then, again, as we've discussed, being that street fighter from New York, instead of just sort of walking away, I put up my dukes and said, you guys are missing the point. It's all well and good to decide that you're going to give an award to somebody and we're going to dress up in monkey suits and we're going to sit around and laud who we are as visual effects workers. But if we're not making any money, and if the fundamental issue with the industry is flawed, the good news is you're going to have this little award with a man of a moon and a George Méliès kind of thing. The bad news is you're going to be unemployed. I went on full attack, and I went after the Visual Effects Society and said, you guys are missing it. You're screwing the pooch. You don't know what you're doing. I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing in the world. We need to fix what the root problem of the industry is. And the powers that be in the Visual Effects Society, the executive board, saw me as a threat. And once again, here was this maverick who was trying to fix something. And of course, they all thought that I was trying to, sort of head up this new effort and that I was going to be that was the furthest thing from my mind. My intention was always to fix what the core problem is with the industry. And so I became blackballed, and they decided that they were not going to pay any attention to me, and I was the enemy, which was ridiculous. Eventually, over a period of time, I decided that if you can't beat them, you got to join them. And so I decided that what I would do is I would run for a board seat in the executive branch, and I did, and I won. And when I got on the board, I realized I was up against all these men and women who the last thing what they wanted to do was to shake up the industry. They were happy getting their awards, and they were happy throwing parties, and they were happy talking about technical advances and lauding the creativity, but they were missing that one leg of the stool. And there was nothing that I could do to be able to change that, because all of the powers that be saw me as a threat. And eventually I decided that I could no longer be a part of the Visual Effects Society, and that they were very good at throwing parties and award ceremonies, and God bless them. I continued to be blackballed by the VES, and I had a conversation with Kim Davidson, who is now the chairman of the VES. Is that his title?
Something in that, yeah.
Yeah, I think he's the chairman, right? And I had a conversation with him in Stuttgart last week at FMX, and I said, I find it interesting that I'm blackballed by the VES. He said, blackballed? You're not blackballed. I said, really? So, if I look at the VES Achievement Awards and the awards that are given out to people, the people that are getting the awards were people that learned from me. And so I've never been feted by the VES. I've never been invited by the VES. In fact, when my friend Sid Mead wound up getting, I think it was a Lifetime Achievement Award, Sid contacted me and he said, hey, Scott, I would like you to give me the award because I value our friendship and I value what you've done to the industry. So I'd like you to be able to give me the award. And so I went back to the board and I said, Sid would like me to give the award. And they refused. They basically said no. So I went back to Sid and said, Sid, they're not allowing me to give the award. And so then Sid contacted, the powers that be, and they acquiesced. And so I finally was able to go to a VES award ceremony and give an award to a very deserving person, one of the greats, Sid Mead. But I still remain blackballed by the VES, and that's the way it is.
I also won an VES award as a student project, basically. I worked on the pipeline. Yeah, we were invited to the award, and as far as I know, it was done by Autodesk, sponsored by Autodesk, and it was different. It doesn't exist anymore, as far as I know, the student VES award. And who if you win. So it was not announced, like you literally get an announcement you won. Come to the VES award. But I remember it was announced a few days before, and as a poor student, I could not afford to fly from Germany to LA on free days before base. And then I heard they rented the suits, which also costs like $100 or something like that. And I was like, wow, this is, and I'm the only person from the team who's not on the photos or because I never been there, and it didn't really change I don't think it changed either ways my life. Either I was there or I wasn't there. I think it's nice that I had the award. I think it in my resume, it created a little bit of a boast, but I don't know, the award itself, for me personally, it was like such a costly thing that I don't really had anything from that part, at least.
Well, don't take it the wrong way. I think award ceremonies are great. I think they're wonderful. But if that's the only intention of the Visual Effects Society is to throw a party and give awards, there's an iceberg up ahead. Do you see it? I mean, it's the reason why Rhythm and Hughes went out of business. It's the reason why Digital Domain loses tens of millions of dollars a year. It's one of the reasons why Technicolor went out of business. Don't you see the damn iceberg? And they're like, iceberg? Let's drink. Let's enjoy ourselves. And so, again, I have no problem with parties and awards and recognizing creative people and technical people. I think it's fantastic. But you got to fix the core problem, and I don't think the VES is willing to do that.
And that is exactly what I mentioned also. I like the award. I think it's great. But the problem is that I was invited as a poor student to an award that I cannot attend because it's just too expensive for me. So it's a little bit the same problem of, like, here's an award. Like it's a little bit like Rhythm and Who's, like, you win an Oscar, but good night. You know, and it's like, it's this like disconnect of like finances versus your award and so on. While you're talking about the iceberg, I also I listened to your book basically on Audible, which I think is fantastic. And
Thanks.
My question to that one is, you have the iceberg on the Titanic basically as the cover image. My question to that is, like, what inspired you to write this book? What was the main motivation behind it?
You know, again, it was a multi-level motivation, right? So one of the motivations was, I think the things that I've learned in my career, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, needs to be passed on. And we've talked about that earlier. There are lessons to be learned about the things that I did that was successful, and there are even more important lessons to learn of the things that I did that was unsuccessful, right? And wait, look at this doggy. He's like, Russell, do you want to get underneath here? Come on.
We keep that in. That will be part of the podcast.
Oh yeah, I love this dog. He's the best. Yeah, so I think that was one part of the equation, is passing on lessons learned, both good and bad. Another part of the equation, frankly, was, setting the record straight. So if you look at Industrial Light and Magic, and like Light and Magic, that documentary that Disney did, I'm never mentioned. I have been written out of the history of Industrial Light and Magic. And the interesting part is that while Jim Morris became the general manager, he became the general manager because I named him the general manager. And in fact, Jim and I worked together for a number of years, even before Industrial Light and Magic. So I was really hurt that the guy that sort of helped transition ILM from the analog world to the digital world, and I think I made a major impact on the company, was written out of its history. Secondarily, when Jim Cameron talks about Digital Domain, and he has done so on several occasions, the biggest one is at a TED conference where he talks about Digital Domain, he says, yeah, then back in 1993, my partner Stan Winston and I started this visual effects company called Digital Domain. And again, he has written me out of the Digital Domain history. And I felt like the truth needed to be told. And so that was another motivation for writing the book.
This is going to be a whole new world. This is a whole new world of creativity for film artists. So I started a company with Stan Winston, my good friend Stan Winston, who is the premier makeup and creature designer at that time, and it was called Digital Domain. And the concept of the company was that we would leapfrog past the kind of analog processes of optical printers and so on, and we would go right to digital production. And we actually did that, and it gave us a competitive advantage for a while. But we found ourselves lagging in the mid-90s in the creature and character design stuff that we had actually founded the company to do.
I think it's a fantastic book. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think it's an interesting autobiography mixed with a part of the visual effects history. There's not many books that can go into the details and also talk about things that you were talking that I don't think I read that many, especially about the finance aspect, the business aspect, and also to some degree your personal kind of
Journey.
path through that and because that is also what we try to do at the podcast, is basically tell the stories but also show that it's not a straight line. Like, just because you worked at this amazing company doesn't mean the future will be automatically straightforward. There is a lot of kind of weird behavior. There is a lot of blacklisting and
Politics.
And I think that is something that I also try to convey, is like, be a little bit more diplomatic. It's not enough to be great at what you do. It's not enough to have a vision of like, oh, I'll be great and I'll work with great people and we're doing great things. If you go that way, you will find at least one person in your environment that doesn't care about all of that, and that they will be offended by things that you do. They will be dismissive of what they do. They take the credit of what you do. And if you are not ready to deal with these people, and you, me, and a few other people, maybe a lot of other people, they find themselves on the short side of the stick, basically, and they find themselves on like paying the price of other people's playing politics, basically. And I think that is really important to understand sometimes, that it's not just about the skills.
The perfect example of that is Steve Spaz Williams, who basically invented, in many ways, modern day creatures and computer graphics from Jurassic Park. And he had not been given his due, and he was pissed off, and he actually fell into drink and ultimately, ruined his career, in my opinion. I love Spaz, and I felt, comfortable in being able to manage him, but he just fell apart. And if you watch, Scott Lebrecht's documentary Jurassic Punk, you'll really understand just the direction that he went in and how terrible his career went as a result of, stamping his foot and saying, "What about me?" And by the way, he deserved the "what about me," because had it not been for him and that early T-Rex, who knows where we would be today. He really was an incredible pioneer in creating the industry as we know today, but he's turned out to be considered to be the bad boy. He did not get his due. He did not get his Oscar. He was not treated fairly, but the way in which he handled it was exactly the wrong way, unfortunately.
A lot of people ask me, what should I do next? There's this kind of thing, it's like, should I even start learning this? Should I even start learning that? There will be an eye replacing me in the future. It's like, what would be your advice for anyone, currently beginning students or maybe artists who are working, and what would be the thing they should focus on from your point of view to kind of go through the next phase of the industry? You went from analog to digital, and now, as you mentioned, we went from digital to AI potentially. What would you say is the next phase and the next step people should do or prepare themselves for?
The first thing I think you need to do is take a good hard look in the mirror and be aware of the 11th commandment. And the 11th commandment is, "Thou shalt not believe thine own hype." So there are a lot of people that are walking around, and I've been taken a task for saying this, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's the truth. There are a lot of people walking around saying, "I am an artist. I'm a digital artist." In fact, I coined the phrase digital artist back when I was at ILM to differentiate by pay scale, digital artist 3, digital artist 2, up until that point, there were no digital artists. And a lot of the men and women that work in the visual effects industry consider themselves artists. Well, really, are they? Are they artists? Do they create art? Some do. Some actually just put, like wheels on a car or hubcaps on a wheel or carburetors in an engine. Are they designing cars? No, they're not designing cars. The director and the producer and the screenwriter is designing the car. They're helping the primary core creative people see their vision. And so you got to take a really long, hard look in the mirror and say, do I have the skill sets? Do I have the passion? Do I have the stomach to actually be a core creative person or a storyteller or a director, which is what I'm getting at. A lot of these folks think they have that. A lot of these folks think that, I could be the next John Lasseter. I could be the next James Cameron. I could be the next Steven Spielberg. And if we look at the visual effects industry, and, I've been at it now for almost 40 years, there's been only a handful of people that have made the leap from being a matte painter or a compositor or whatever it is in the visual effects world to being a core creative storyteller. Now, we also say, well, the problem in the past was there were a lot of gatekeepers, and you're absolutely right. But we could go back to the mid-1980s when John Warnock at Adobe created PostScript. And when they created PostScript, a whole bunch of people thought, now I have the tool to be a editor and a creative director of a magazine, so I'm going to create a magazine. And the fact is that literally thousands of magazines were created as a result of having the tool like PostScript to create a magazine. Unfortunately, the thousands upon thousands of magazines that were created, only a handful or maybe a dozen or 24 of them actually rose to the top and wound up being a viable magazine, because the other thousands and thousands of magazine editors and creative directors didn't have the skill sets to be core creative and be a magazine publisher. And I question the folks that are looking at AI as now we've got the tools to create these movies that have really high production value. And you do. And as a visual effects worker, you have the skill set to create those images. And I have to say, a lot of the AI films that I've seen are stunningly beautiful, but they have no soul. There's no character development. There's no arc. It's the same old crap. Blow it up, an alien, whatever it is, and it's beautiful, but is it storytelling? So I think a real hard look in the mirror to be able to say, do I have what it takes to be a storyteller? And yes, the gatekeepers will be less, and there will be, as a result of these new tool sets, a lot more core creative people that will rise up to the top. But are you one of them? If in looking in the mirror and you decide, you know what, I might not have the skill set, the capability, the creativity, the passion, the gutsiness to be that person, there are opportunities for the skills that you do have, and the skills that you do have will be able to play in various forms, from medicine and advertising and manuals for products or whatever, where now as the world becomes more digital and more visual, your skill sets could apply to those kinds of opportunities. And so if that's the case, what you need to learn is you need to learn all of the tool sets that are available and will become available in this coming age of artificial intelligence.
What is the progress on the Hiroshima movie of the 1,000 Cranes?
I understand that Jim is now making a movie about Hiroshima, which is, I thought, interesting. Years ago, when I developed this screenplay, I asked Jim to read it, and we sat down at Chai of Venice, and we talked about it, and then our relationship had fallen apart. So, now with Oppenheimer, which again, I'm a Chris Nolan fan, but I think he missed the point, as I think Ridley Scott misses the point a lot, British filmmakers, is that what about the Japanese? What did this bomb do? It's like that wasn't covered. It was really the trials and tribulations that Oppenheimer faced, but, what he and his team put together changed the world and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. So why wasn't that addressed? It was briefly addressed in Oppenheimer. It was almost like a throwaway. And then now Jim is making this film, or he says he's making this film about this real person who survived both Hiroshima and then moved to go back to Nagasaki and then survived the Nagasaki bomb. And so, you know, generally everything that Jim Cameron does is incredibly successful. So I'm hoping with the success of Oppenheimer and hopefully with the success of, I think it's called The Last Train to Hiroshima or something, the film that Jim's going to make will be also successful, and that will open up the opportunity for 1,000 Cranes. Martin Campbell, the director who directed, you know, Zorro and Casino Royale, who I'm a big fan of, has been attached to it. And, you know, it's at the end of the day, as when I give talks at film schools to students and I ask the fundamental question, what gets a movie made? And most of the kids raised their hand, they said, a great script. You know, and I said, that's just nonsense. No, what gets a movie made is money, is financing. And without the financing, you're, as we say, peeing in the wind. So I'm still looking for the financing for the film. The budget to make the film has gone down considerably from when I first started it, because now we have all these tools, some of which are AI, some of which are virtual production, that will allow us to do things and bring the budget down considerably. So I think the movie, depending upon who the above the line people are, you know, could be made for $50 to $75 million. And when I first started it, I thought it was about $150 million. So if you happen to have a checkbook, Alex, and you're prepared to write a check, operators are standing by, and we'll send you the Ginsu knives as well.
Scott, thank you very much. I really hope that this will have an opportunity. Maybe with the new technology, this will be possible also with lower finances. But also, I think if you believe in something for so many years, I think it's just kind of, there is some time where you either make it or you just shelf it, basically, at the end of the day. But I really appreciate you being here, you talking at the FMX. I saw you there. You writing the book, which I believe is fantastic, and everyone, I can recommend it to read it. I think Upstart is a great book. I listen it on Audible. You can also buy it as a copy, and if you meet Scott in person, he can also sign it, as you did at the FMX, for example. I met, for example, Ed Hooks, who had a copy of your book as well, with your signature in there. And I really appreciate your time and taking the time for that. Any final things you would like to share that you would like to communicate with everyone who's currently listening? We have a lot of people joining the industry that are watching this podcast, but also people who are part of the industry. They just want to, you know, figure things out for themselves, basically.
Yeah, well, twofold. One is you need to follow your bliss, and so even if you take a look, when you take that long, hard look in the mirror, and you still believe that you have the skills, the passion, the creative spark to be able to tell stories, by all means do it. Don't give up. You know, maybe you have a plan B and you take a job doing something that pays the rent, but continue to pursue that dream. And, you know, I have a friend who is a guitar player. He still believes he's going to be the next Miles Davis. We met when we were in college. He's now 75 years old, and he's still pursuing it. So don't give up and continue down that path, but also be realistic and realize, am I that person?
That's it with this week's episode of the 21 Artist Show. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This podcast is 100% ad-free, and to keep it that way, check out my website 21artistshow.com. There you can find exclusive access to awesome masterclasses and coaching opportunities to work successfully in visual effects, animation, and games. Just go to 21artistshow.com. And don't forget to share it with people who would benefit from that content and tell them they're awesome. See you on the next episode.